it's kind of hard to know what to say at this point, especially following so many lawyers who've been in very great detail and then kind of coming out. Well, first of all, it's great to be here. I actually started my legal career in the region. I'm Canadian, but my partner was a diplomat, and I wrote my New York bar. I was at McGill Law School, but decided I wanted to get out fast, and started practicing as a lawyer in Indonesia, if you can imagine, and that was many moons ago. Suharto had just fallen, and I was doing oil and gas law, which always surprises folks. But it's great to be back, and the conversation is just so different when I think about, where we're at, because sometimes it can seem like, are we making enough progress? Obviously, we're not. The video at the very start shows that, or you can just look on Twitter right now at what's happening in Dubai. They got a 1.5 year amount of rain in one day. So look, I'm going to give you some examples of how things have changed from what I've seen, both as I was Minister of Environment and Climate Change in Canada. I started my career 3 days later going to the Paris Agreement negotiations. Then I was Minister of Infrastructure, so that's much better because you get to spend money, much better than regulating. It makes people generally happier, although there's never enough money. So we do need to figure out, as Sue said, like how do we actually get more finance going, because there's not enough government money, that's for sure. And now in this role where I'm out, I've left politics, so I'm a recovering politician and a recovering lawyer. Although, as Dilhan said, you never leave law, so people are like, oh my gosh, is she really going to go into that level of detail? I was like, yeah, I'm totally going into that level of detail, where I'm working on net zero, but also supporting a large number of corporates, financial institutions, and really looking at scaling climate action. So if we look at the Paris Agreement, so as I say, I was like, I was just a new minister. Someone called me like a baby minister. 2 days in, there I am for the pre-negotiations for Paris, and I said, like, I'm in. I will do anything you want me to take on. So it was Article 6. I was told, okay, well, that's great. We got some real challenges here. We got to land Article 6. Now, my background is trade and competition, antitrust law, which antitrust has come up, sadly, in the US context on net zero. But at that point, actually, I was like, okay, great. I'm going to figure out Article 6. Luckily, I had very smart negotiators on our team. But if you look at how far we've come, now, I know it's annoying. Have we landed Article 6.2 and 6.4 and all of the details around that? No, but I left. Had I been there, maybe we'd be further along. I'm joking. It's obviously a complex place. But when we started, I mean, obviously we've had credits before with maybe we'd say mixed success. But the negotiations, I mean, in a way, it's kind of funny because, first of all, there was a hurdle because when you bring the whole world together, people have different views, no surprise. But we're negotiating the market tax in a number of countries, I think led by Nicaragua, don't believe in markets, so we couldn't use the word market. So that was a little hard when you're negotiating a market text. So if you think 6.4 is incomprehensible, it is incomprehensible because we had to innovate in that space. But the good news is we have made a lot of progress. And when you look at Singapore, I'm advising Singapore. We're starting tomorrow. I'm one of the international advisors on carbon markets. I mean, Singapore is already concluding agreements with other countries. So under Article 6.2, so that is good. We are making progress in innovating. Carbon pricing, I had to go back to Canada. So after the Paris Agreement negotiations, we had been a huge laggard on climate change, and so I had to go back to Canada, negotiate a comprehensive climate plan with all our provinces and territories, and we have kind of like the small island state, Prince Edward Island, and then we kind of have the petro-state, Alberta, a little bit of Saskatchewan, very, very different views, but the hardest thing we needed to do was get carbon pricing. It's still a fight. We actually got through 2 elections on carbon pricing. It looks like there will be a 3rd election on carbon pricing. Sadly, with conservatives, they call it a job-killing carbon tax. And I was like, it was actually a conservative idea. Like, use the market to foster, choices, and you can choose if you want to pay or you want to innovate. But carbon pricing has come a long way too. Singapore, a great example, and congratulations to Singapore. I mean, it's not easy doing carbon pricing for a variety of reasons. Also the interactive effects, needing to figure that out. So that is that's a positive story as well, because you see countries around the world making a lot of progress on carbon pricing. Actually, for the Americans here, I don't know how many Americans are here, was George Shultz, who told me when you do a direct price, a carbon tax on people, make sure it's revenue neutral. So that's what we did in Canada. All the money goes directly back, such that 80% of people are better off. But there's been a lot of progress in there as well. And when we come to carbon markets, and I think this was a really interesting point that was made, is that sometimes governments are going to be far behind. So you will need innovation coming from the private sector. And you can see that in voluntary carbon markets. And I mean, if you're going to get the price you want, you have to have integrity. So you have to have rules around what is required. On the blended finance space, I mean, look, I also am I'm very tired of this story. I go to international negotiations and everyone's like, if only we could get more blended finance. And then folks are like, we have so much money, we don't have projects. And then other people are like, well, we're developing projects, but you won't give us money. And then everyone's like, well, who's going to be the risk capital? So in Canada, actually, so we have it's called the Canada Infrastructure Bank. It's really a financing mechanism. I inherited it and it had one project. So that wasn't great because then everyone wanted to kill it, and it was $35 billion out of our fisc. So the government had set aside $35 billion. And this might be a lesson, because I think we're all going to have to share as many lessons as we can when it comes to solving problems very quickly. We do not have time. We're far behind, and we're going to have to innovate, and we're going to have to be practical. But what we did is I realized that we actually had this investment bank or this vehicle that was competing with private capital. So I said, folks, okay, that's not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to get outcomes. And I think we're lawyers. Sometimes we get very caught up in process. We always obviously have to focus on outcomes and innovate. I said, yeah, one, I want you to get your money back, yes. But I'm much more concerned on outcomes like GHG reductions. It also had to do with other things like clean drinking water in indigenous communities. So that is an outcome as opposed to how much your return is, because I see that as a return on investment. So hopefully in the international space, like right now we have the spring meetings, World Bank meetings, they'll actually be digging a bit deeper. There's a lot of focus on AAA ratings. That's not unimportant, but that's not an outcome. Outcome is actually getting more capital that we desperately need in the trillions to go. So I think my point, and maybe one other example actually I should talk about, is net zero. So I was asked by the UN Secretary General. I left politics. I wasn't entirely sure what I was going to do. Started my own business because I decided I didn't really want to work for anyone else. I'd had a lot of experience in government where people are telling you what to do. So, but then the Secretary General asked me if I would chair a task force with the world's longest name. The UN, actually, for acronyms, it's really terrible. First of all, it's HLEG, so that's non-description, high-level expert group. That doesn't actually mean anything. But it's on the net zero commitments of non-state entities. So really, net zero commitments by financial institutions, corporates, cities, and regions. And part of it is about integrity. One, it's about, there are things you need to do. And to the point on greenwashing, because it was really to do two things. One, it was to be clear what are the criteria and standards for net zero, because you can measure net zero. Some things are hard to measure, but net zero emissions need to go down, money needs to go to at scale to clean, and you need to figure out a just transition. Now that sounds really easy. You can read our report. It's got 10 recommendations. I only work in 3 and 10s, but I mean, obviously the transition plans and the different requirements are challenging. But it was also, so as to do criteria and standards, but also address the concerns around greenwashing. Because I mean, let's be real, there is greenwashing, and greenwashing has a really terrible impact. Because one, it overinflates what we're actually doing, because we still have a long ways to go. But it also penalizes the folks that are leading the way. And our 10th recommendation was regulating, because I think ultimately, and we heard this even from folks, sometimes people are surprised that folks in the voluntary carbon markets talk about the need to eventually regulate, but they're doing, they're setting up criteria and standards in the absence of that, because they need to get value, and credibility and integrity is very important to that. So I think my point on this is we have come a very long way in quite a short period of time. But we're very far, obviously, from where we need to be. I mean, I have no doubt that we will, if it was just about innovation and dealing with entrenched interests, eventually we would get there. We just are super far from the timeline, the scale and scope we need right now. And that's why I come to lawyers. So you guys are all super smart. You're lawyers, or you're people who hang out with lawyers and find them just kind of a bit frustrating, maybe sometimes arrogant, and sometimes really nitpicky on things. But I think the advice to those of you who are lawyers, and if you're not a lawyer, you can maybe pass on this advice to your lawyers, I'm sure you do, we're gonna have to think differently. And so when I was working as a minister, I remember sometimes lawyers coming to me and I'd say, okay, this is the outcome we're trying to get. And what they would tell me, and this isn't like what I'm hearing on the stage, obviously these are people that are the innovators, but they'd be like, well, here are all the reasons you can't do this. And I'd say, oh, sorry, did you misunderstand my question? I was like, how do I do this? You tell me the risk and I will assess whether I want to take on that risk. So I think that really being in the solution space and really pushing yourself, because we are going to have to innovate, and in all these different areas, but I mean, I could go on and on. I mean, you heard from folks like free, prior, and informed consent. Actually, that's a really big topic in Canada when it comes to major resource development. I mean, there are so many different areas that we are trying to deal with all at once. And so that is going to require being in a real solution mode and really innovating and digging deep and thinking about how do we do things as opposed to how do we perpetuate the status quo or make marginal changes. The second thing that I think is really important is recognizing that often being risk adverse is risky. Now, that's kind of a funny thing to say from a lawyer, but often I hear, oh, it's really hard, maybe we shouldn't do this. We are going to have to take some risk. The financial sector knows that. To get returns, you're going to have to take some risks. But I think from lawyers, we're going to have to figure that out because we try to make everything perfect and address all the risks. And we heard that from Kimberly. We're not going to be able to get the solutions we need as quickly as we need them. Everyone's going to have to keep super up to date, and it's messy. I always laugh when I hear like we need an orderly transition. I was like, first of all, I don't think it's orderly for many people right now, people in Dubai or wherever we're seeing the latest disaster. But it's not going to be orderly in the sense that we all might like. Like it's not going to be every country is going to have harmonized regulations and the market's going to work perfectly and we're going to all have the right incentives. That's not what it's going to be. It's going to be messy. And we're all going to have to live in that, but at the same time, be pragmatic. But it will require that you keep up to date. Because, I mean, in the context of just take one piece, when it comes to Scope 3 emissions and voluntary carbon markets, and obviously that space, there's a lot going on in that. But, take what Europe is doing. Like, Europe is already requiring that folks have a net zero target, that they cover all scopes, and that they disclose. So that has a huge impact on a lot of companies because if you meet a threshold, like you have an office in Europe, I'm not exactly sure, that I don't practice, so I'm not giving no legal advice here, don't take any of my advice, but on the details. But I think that different jurisdictions are taking different approaches, but they also have they have real impacts on folks, and they also show a trend, which is also about future-proofing companies. I think that, if you aren't thinking longer term than what is required right now, you're missing things. I work closely with Mark Carney, so he was the governor of the Bank of Canada and then the governor of the Bank of England, but he worked on the task force for climate-related financial disclosures. And I remember being at, I guess it was the World Economic Forum, like, I don't know, a decade ago, and people were like, I have no idea what he's talking about. That is going nowhere fast. And now, this is actually a requirement. So I think that is something, the future-proofing piece is actually really important. Don't think that things are going to stay the way they are, or the fact that in the US, yes, it is very messy in the US, although California is the 4th largest economy, or 5th, the largest in the world, I'm not sure. What is it? 5th. It depends on who you're talking to from California, to be honest. I mean, it's a major player, and they are really advancing the law. I don't know what's going to happen in the next election. If you're Canadian, you desperately worried about that, but maybe the whole world is. But we are making progress. And then I guess the last thing is maybe just what we started with, the title, which is How Do Lawyers Drive Decarbonization? And I think in the end, like, this is really where it's incumbent on all of us. I have 3 kids. Like, why did I do this? Why am I still banging my head on climate? Like, working on all these different areas, always trying to figure out, okay, globally, how are we going to do this? How are we going to bring people together? What if there's a new Trump administration? How are we going to be more resilient? It's because we need to figure this out. Like, in a way, it's almost bonkers that we're in a situation where we actually know what the problem is. We know what most of the solutions are, but we still are quite far. Let's be realistic. Like, we are very far from where we need to be. And so I think that's really where I leave you folks. And maybe I'll put it in a sporting analogy. So maybe anyone who heard me before, I'm a swimmer. I used to compete in swimming. And you have a stretch goal. Whether or not you accept 1.5 that we can do it, I mean, I'm like, a stretch goal is a stretch goal. It's hard. That when you swim and you start off swimming or whatever sport you do and you're young, like, you set a stretch goal and everyone thinks you're bonkers. But the whole point is, if you want to win, you got to have a stretch goal. If you want to be the best in the world. And that is, we have a stretch goal, but you got to do the work every single day. And you can't get disappointed, and you have to innovate, and then you just have to get up and you have to do more, and you have to do it faster, and you have to do it better, and then you do need this radical collaboration. So if I could only leave you on that, I don't know how, after following very, very smart people who are far better informed and knowledgeable than I am, I mean, I think it's just, lawyers matter, and it's really important that the skills that all you folks have actually make a real difference as we try to figure out at a very fast pace how we can actually, win. And what is winning? Winning is cleaner air, it's cleaner water, of course it's economic growth, it's innovation, it's new business opportunities, but I mean, most of all, it's a sustainable future for our kids. Thanks.